So let's take a look at drafting the raglan sleeve. You will need your front and back bodice slopers as well as your basic sleeve sloper. Begin by tracing your front and back bodices exactly as you see here. And to start, we're going to take care of the back bodice first. What I want to do is transfer this shoulder dart into my armhole, adding a little bit of fullness into the armhole. You can do this when tracing your back sloper by placing a pin at this dart point and then pivoting your dart closed, opening it up in the armhole. I'll be doing the slash and spread method, so it's a little bit easier to understand. From my dart point, I'm going to draw my slash line into my back armhole. Doesn't matter where it goes. Cut along the slash line to but not through the dart point, and then cut along either of the two dart legs. Again, to but not through the dart point, so we have free range of motion with this little piece here. I'm going to grab a scrap piece of paper and stick that underneath my work. Grab some tape, close my back dart, shoulder dart. So I'm going to place this underneath and close this back shoulder dart. Tape it closed. It opens this fullness in the armhole, and I'm going to place a nice piece of tape to hold that down. Trimming some of my excess paper over here. We'll take care of the rest of it in a moment. The only reason I've done this is to add some fullness to this armhole and to get rid of this shoulder dart. Let's set this aside and get the front bodice. With the front bodice, we want to distribute or transfer some of this waistline dart into our armhole. In the textbook, we're meant to pivot or transfer a 1/2 inch of fullness into the armhole, but on half scale, that's 1/4 inch. So again, you could place a pin at your apex and close, mark a slash into your armhole, pivot from the apex, closing your waistline dart just enough to open 1/4 inch in the armhole. But again, I'll be doing slash and spread, so it's a little easier to understand. I'm going to draw my slash line from my apex into my armhole. I recommend drawing your slash line above the armhole notch just to make the next few steps a little easier. So I'm going to slash into my armhole, and I'm going above my armhole notch. Cut along this new slash line. To but not through the apex. And cut along either of the two dart legs. Again, to but not through the apex point. So we want free range of motion for this little piece over here. Grab some scrap paper. Place that underneath your work. Now, I want to lock down this portion of my draft because I only need to make changes to this portion here. So to keep this in place, I'm going to place a piece of tape along this side of my slash line onto my new paper. And then give myself a guideline on my new piece of paper. From this slash line, I'm going to measure out 1/4 inch and give myself a bit of a guideline just so I know where to place this portion of my slash line. I'm going to close my waistline dart just enough until this side of my slash line touches that guideline. So you can see that a little bit better. Closing the waistline dart until that slash line touches that guideline, and then tape that in place. I'm I'm going to tape down here because I do want to erase this guideline. Doesn't matter if it's still there, we just don't need it anymore. Tape down this other dart leg. Don't forget there is still a dart here in the waistline. We can bring our back bodice back into play, and we're going to make some changes to the two of these. Note that all we've done is add fullness into the armhole by an equal amount. On half scale, this dart is 1/4 inch wide, so we've added 1/4 inch to the back armhole. So we've done the same on the front, adding 1/4 inch to the front armhole. What we want to do now is lower these points where the armhole meets the side seam. The textbook wants us to drop these points by 1.5 inches on full scale, so that'll be 3/4 inch on half scale. Using my ruler, I'm going to drop this point 3/4 inch, and the same over here, 3/4 inch. And then I want to redraft these armholes. I'm going to start with the back. I want to start from my low shoulder point, smooth into this portion of the curve of the armhole as much as I can, and touching that new dropped armhole point. Just so I can commit this, I'm going to commit this in marker. I recommend you do the same. Find a marker or pen or something so we can clearly see what we started with and the draft that we ended up with. So that's my new dropped armhole on the back. For the front, I also want to go through the low shoulder point. I want to go somewhere in between these two slash points, so somewhere down the middle, and then smoothing into this lowered armhole. All right, low shoulder point, it's going somewhere in between the two of these 2 points, somewhere close to the middle, midpoint, and then down into that new lowered armhole. I've gone ahead and traced over my 2 bodices, marking out where my new dropped armholes are, my enlarged and dropped armholes, and my new waist dart here in my front bodice. I recommend you do the same. Trace over it with a marker or a pen so we can clearly see what we're working with now. Don't forget that there are a series of notches that still exist on these drafts, so don't forget those. And the next thing we need to take care of is marking out the yokes that we're going to use on this. If you want to true up this dart peak on the front, you're welcome to do so. I'm not going to bother to do that though. But let's focus on the back bodice and mark out our yoke. The yoke takes place, it's going to sit somewhere up here near the shoulder. What I'm going to do, according to the textbook, down here where the armhole meets the side seam, I'm going to mark that as point A. And I'm going to mark this inside of my draft and not outside on this spare paper so I don't lose where these points are. Up here, my low shoulder point is going to be point B. And then the text wants us to measure this curve, find the midpoint, add 1/2 inch and all kinds of things. You can place the point where the yoke is going to intersect with the armhole anywhere you'd like. I recommend going above the notches just so we don't lose where those notches are. And for the sake of working in half scale, I'm going to start from point A and measure 2.5 inches along this armhole line. It's going to make our jobs a little bit easier if we choose a measurement to work with. You can choose any measurement you like. I just like 2.5 inches. You can use your bendy ruler to measure that 2.5 inches from point A up along the armhole. I'm going to use my curve runner. 2.5 inches sits right about there, just above my 2 armhole notches. This will be point X. I'm going to mark X just above that, just beside that armhole, just so we can see it clearly on the video. Big old point X right there. From point X, I'm going to draw my yoke style line into my neckline. Again, there are techniques for drawing that. that the book has illustrated, but just to keep it simple, draw whatever style line you think is appealing to your eye, so long as it intersects somewhere inside of the neckline. Okay, I've gone over my X, so I'm going to rewrite the letter X here, just so we can clearly see where that is. So there's the yoke that I have deemed for my back bodice, point B being the low shoulder point, and X being measured 2.5 inches up from A. Let's take care of the front. I'm also going to label this point and this point. Down here where the armhole meets the side seam will be point C, and up here at the low shoulder point will be point D. I'll also measure from point C up along the armhole 2.5 inches, just like I did on the back. 2.5 inches sits right here. Put a nice big point on there so you can see it. That will also be point X on my front armhole. And now I'll draw whichever style line I would like into my neckline. Try not to go over my X point. I'll have to rewrite it, I'm sure. So again, there's point X where it intersects my armhole, and point D being my low shoulder point. And I've got my two yokes, my back and my front yoke marked. If you need to, this is a good time because we're about to cut along these style lines. I recommend marking this as your back yoke and your front yoke, because they're going to start to look identical once we cut them away from the bodices. And we don't want to get confused in the next step when we attach them to the sleeve. So go ahead and cut along your two style lines and cut along these yokes so that they're nice and cleanly defined. All right, my front and back bodices have been separated from their two respective yokes, and I've cleaned up my cut lines all the way around the yokes. It's going to make the next few steps easier. These two bodice pieces are done. You can affix them to other pieces of paper if you want to just fill in the space, but I'm going to leave them as is. Leave them as slopers. I'm not adding any seam allowance, but be sure to label them appropriately. Front raglan sleeve, front bodice, raglan sleeve, back bodice. Make sure you make note of the notches that still exist, the darts and dart points, the apex, center front, center back, yada, yada, yada. But these are good to go. I'm going to set them aside. The two yokes I'm going to affix to my sleeve. Set these two to the side for now. We're going to need them in just a moment. Copy your basic sleeve onto a new piece of paper. Leave some paper up above here because we're going to have some extra height to place our yokes into place. So copy your sleeve. Be sure to mark all of the necessary notches, especially the front notch and the two notches in the back. Do mark out where your elbow line is, as well as your wrist and the two underarm seams. Up at the top of our draft, right at the very peak of our sleeve cap, we're going to raise the sleeve cap by 1/8 of an inch for half scale, and we're going to mark a horizontal guideline. So there's my dart peak. Remember, one of these tiny squares is 1/8 of an inch. I'm placing that 1/8 of an inch mark at the top of my sleeve cap, making sure it aligns vertically with my grain line, and give myself a guideline 1/8 of an inch above my sleeve cap peak. My two bicep points sitting out here are going to get dropped by 1.5 inches according to the textbook. That's a 3/4 of an inch for half scale. It's the same amount that we dropped the armholes on our front and back bodice. So however much, if you're working on full scale and working on your own draft, however much you drop your armholes on the front, drop these 2 bicep points by the same amount. So 3/4 of an inch dropped here and here. These 2 points will be point E and point F. So I will label those accordingly, E and F, and I'm going to redraft my new lowered biceps. It should smooth into your notches on both sides. So guideline at the top, E and F dropped by 3/4 of an inch at the bicep. Now we're going to get our yokes into place. Just going to zoom in a little here at the sleeve cap because all that is going to be happening up here at the top. I'm going to grab my back and my front yokes. Now pay close attention to where these each go. Remember that the front of your sleeve is identified by a single notch, and the back of your sleeve is identified by a set of double notches. So make sure when you're placing these yokes that you place them in their respective sides of the sleeve. Don't put your front yoke to the back with the double notches. Don't put your back yoke to the front with the single notch. Be sure to keep them to their respective sides of the sleeve. Now, what the book wants me to do is to align my 2 X points that are sitting down here to the X points on the sleeve cap. Problem is, there's no X points on my sleeve cap. To find those X points, I have to recall the measurements that I took along these lines here. You can either walk your new dropped armhole to your new dropped bicep, but I remembered I measured 2.5 inches on my front and back, which is why it helps to use a nice round number that you can remember when you're doing this particular type of draft. So starting from point F and point E, I'm going to measure that 2.5 inches up along the front and back of my sleeve cap. There we go. This ensures that we are affixing our yokes to the same place where they would sit on our sleeve cap. So I'm going to make a nice round dot so we can see where our 2 X points are. There's X over here on the front and X over there on the back. And I'm going to place, I'm going to start with the front yoke and zoom in here so you can see what I'm about to do. Matching the 2 X points. If you're working on a pinnable work surface, you can place a pin right in this point of your yoke so you can pivot this from your X point. I don't have a pinnable work surface at the moment, so I'm just going to use my pencil to hold it into place. And I'm going to pivot my front yoke until D, my low shoulder point, touches this guideline. That's looking pretty good right there. Going to take that into place. Okay. Do the same for my back. Matching up, remember the back goes to the double notches back here. Match up my X points. You can place a pin in it if you're working with a pinnable work surface. And pivot until B touches that guideline as well. Now depending on the depth of your X point, where you've placed your X point, the position of B and D is going to be different on different drafts. So what I've done here may not match exactly what you do. If you choose a different depth for your X point, that's perfectly fine. What's important is that points B and D touch this guideline, get as close to touching it as possible. Now I want to find the midpoint between points B and D. Note that my original grain line for my sleeve is sitting here, but I need to split my sleeve between these 2 points here. So I'm just going to eyeball where the center of those 2 points are, somewhere around here, and that'll be point Z on my draft. So that'll be Z, right in the middle between B and D. The book has instructions for moving this point, which they're calling Y, forward by 5/8 of an inch. We don't have to do that because we're not working with a sleeve that has an elbow dart. That's also why we don't have any ease notches on here, because we're not working with any ease in the elbow, just a simple tapered sleeve. So we need to find the point between B and D, and let's mark this point down here where the grain line intersects the wrist. That'll be point Y down here. So there's Y and Z. Draw a line between Y and Z. I'm going to use my marker so I can clearly see it. Oh no, I'm not going to do that. Never mind. Pencil. Z to Y. This is going to shift our grain line, balancing out our sleeve. So we have a new grain line that's been tilted that way towards Z. Again, yours may look different depending on how you've drafted your yokes and where your B and D points sit on that guideline. The next thing I'm going to do is draw some slash lines into Z. Now follow real close, this might get a little bit crazy. From E, I'm going to draw a slash line to Z, and from F, I'll draw a slash line to Z. Note that these slash lines will not be straight lines, they're going to be curved lines. It does not matter what they look like. They do not have to be symmetrical, they do not have to be perfect. They just have to connect E to Z. And F to Z. So long as you're drawing these slash lines inside of this new dropped sleeve cap, it's perfectly fine. Doesn't matter what they look like as long as they're there. Now we're going to do a whole lot of cutting and subsequent taping. First thing to do is going to be cut along your Z to Y line. So I'm going to cut across Z to Y, and I'm going to continue through the rest of the paper and separate the front and the back of my raglan sleeve. There's my front, there's my back, and then I'm going to cut along those slash lines that I made, cutting from E and cutting to but not through Z, and again cutting from F and cutting to but not through Z. So we should have two pieces to your sleeve, your front and your back, and these should have some free range of motion to your Z point. Let's get a fresh piece of paper. To lay the drafts onto. I'm going to go ahead and tape this Z to Y slash line into place. And before I go too far, I want to open these two slash lines up. According to the text, it should be 2 inches for full scale, but I'll be doing half scale, so there should be a 1-inch space added between these two slash lines. So I will do just like I did for my front bodice. From E, from this point down here, I'm going to measure 1 inch and give myself a guideline so I know how far to create a space there. And the same over here, give myself a 1-inch guideline so I know how far to pivot these two pieces. Let's work on the front, so making sure Z is in place. Open that up about 1 inch till it touches my guideline and tape that in place. take care of the same on the back. Pivot from Z until that touches that 1-inch guideline. There we go. Now the last thing to do is to clean up some of these lines. If we look very closely, we'll see here that our yokes follow along our shoulders and then quickly jut out to our Z points. So it comes along our shoulder here and then corner and another corner. Same thing here. Shoulder goes out to the corner on that guideline and back down the corner down that new grain line. So we want to get rid of these little corners. Nobody likes sewing corners, so let's get rid of them. To do so, from Z, measure 1.5 inches on half scale down, and this is a rather arbitrary number, but according to the text, they want 3 inches, so I'm doing 1.5 inches for half scale. So measuring 1.5 inches down, I'm just going to put a little mark there just so I know where those points are. And I'm going to use that as a guideline, resting my French curve on that point, smoothing it as best I can in between the Z to D point and smoothing it into the shoulder. Just creating a little bit of roundness over that shoulder. I need to get a new marker. So we smoothed over that Z point, and I'll continue drafting out our new shoulder seams. So this becomes an elongated shoulder seam that goes all the way over the shoulder and all the way down the top of the arm. I also want to clean up these 2 slash lines here. Now the reason we've slashed this is because we're working with a tapered sleeve. When we drop the biceps, it makes the biceps slightly narrower. So this is adding a little bit more fullness under the arm to make room for the biceps. And to smooth that, I'm going to draw from these points up here at the top of my slash line, smoothing a curve into my elbow line, which is why we marked our elbow line at the very beginning. Same thing over here on the front. From this top of the slash line from F, smooth into the elbow. You can see where my original yokes were, where we've added that smoothness over the shoulder around our Z point. We now have this shoulder seam that extends all the way through. These would be cut as one single piece for the back and for the front. Don't forget that the notches still exist along the armhole, that we have our dropped biceps that smooth into the elbow, down into the wrist. The other thing to mark is where your B and D points are. Those should be notches. And if you have a lot of marks on your paper and it's difficult to identify that there's a notch there, then just mark it on the paper, notch. So we know that there are notches here and here. So just make it clear that there are notches. There are also some notches that exist in the mid shoulder up there. So total of 4 drafts, raglan sleeve, back bodice sloper, raglan sleeve, front bodice sloper, raglan sleeve, back sleeve sloper, raglan sleeve, front sleeve sloper.